All right, welcome back. Our next panel is called Ransomware Attacks Before and After: Preparation, Governance, Training, and Remediation. This is a great panel, and we have a great group with us today. Let me first introduce Trent Duffy, who is a partner at FGS Global in its public affairs practice. Trent has previously served in several top positions in the White House, Congress, and in the private sector, including as Chief Deputy Press Secretary for President George W. Bush. He is joining us today from DC. Welcome, Trent.
Thank you, Bruce.
Let me next introduce Dan Greene, a partner at Octillo. Dan combines being an experienced trial attorney with significant data breach experience across pretty much every industry. In addition to representing clients in breach and privacy litigation, Dan counsels clients worldwide and is a certified information privacy professional in Europe. Joining us today from Miami, congrats on that, Dan. Welcome.
Thanks, Bruce.
I'd like to next introduce Megan Kayo, who is a partner-elect. Congratulations, in the San Francisco office of Wilson Sonsini, where she specializes in data breach response and mitigation. She's worked on hundreds of data breaches and security incidents and acted as the lead counsel directing the investigation, the notifications, responses to regulators and consumers on a number of global data breaches affecting millions of records. Megan joining us today from San Francisco. Welcome.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
And finally, our moderator today is Travis LeBlanc. He is a partner at Cooley and vice chair of the firm's cyber data privacy practice. If you have a couple of hours, go to Travis's bio. Let me summarize as quickly as I can here, though. In recent years, he's been selected by the U.S. Department of Commerce and the European Commission as an arbitrator in the EU-U.S. Privacy Shield framework, unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board in 2019, then renominated again in 2022. Congratulations. Previously chief of the FCC's Enforcement Bureau during the Obama administration, also a senior advisor to former California AG Kamala Harris and a special assistant attorney general of California. Joining us today from Singapore. Welcome, Travis. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
I know it's quite late there, but thank you very much, and take it away.
No problem. Thank you, Bruce. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, at least to me, to all of you. I am Travis LeBlanc from Cooley, and I'm very excited to be moderating this panel of leading experts and practitioners to discuss what's happening in the world of ransomware attacks, a space that continues to evolve quickly, involves a variety of actors, and necessitates preparation and incident response planning from companies who may be targets of ransomware attacks. The Ransomware Conference is a staple of the Incident Response Forum. Every year, we try to focus the panel on what's new in the past year and where we expect ransomware to go in 2023. Let me start with a few numbers about this perennial cybersecurity issue. Some suggest that ransomware attacks are on track to cause $30 billion of damages to organizations globally by 2023. Just in the first half of 2022, there were a total of 236 million ransomware attacks worldwide. Yet only 30% of organizations have a ransomware-specific incident response playbook. 30%. Some estimates say that ransomware attacks have actually decreased in volume in 2022, as have the number of organizations paying ransoms, but the ransom demands have kept coming and have kept increasing. Our goal today in this session is to cover what's been happening in the space of late so that you all are on alert and hopefully provide some tips for preventative measures in this rapidly changing environment. Our topic today is ransomware attacks before and after: preparation, governance, training, and remediation. As the title suggests, our panelists today will walk us through just that, a myriad of ways companies can prepare for and respond to ransomware attacks, even against the constantly evolving regulatory backdrop and threat landscape. As you heard from their biographies, our panelists are on the front lines of helping companies and organizations address this increasingly pervasive threat of ransomware. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone knows the chat function is open and available. I'll aim to monitor the questions throughout the session. If you have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A, and we'll try to cover those in the session if possible. With that, let's get started. Every year, we see new trends with the threat actors' tactics and tools evolving. I'm sure that everyone in the audience is eager to know, what trends are all of you seeing in ransomware attacks these days? Let's have Megan kick us off, and then maybe Trent and Dan, you hopefully can share your views as well.
Thanks, Travis. So as far as what we're seeing in the field and on the front lines is that across the board, threat actors are acting very aggressively and opportunistically. So rather than like back in the day when it was ransomware only consisting of the encryption of data, we're consistently seeing threat actors looking for other opportunities to exploit the company and really pressure the company to pay ransoms. So whether that's stealing data before they deploy decryption, or demanding a ransom for the return of that data, or pressuring whether it's customers or employees or other stakeholders to try and get the company to pay the ransom. We're seeing a lot of that. As far as opportunistically, I recently had a client that had ransomware deployed on the day that they announced a big deal that they were being acquired. So we're seeing, and so that added additional leverage because the client just wanted to make sure that the deal got done. So they really wanted to resolve this issue as quickly as possible. So there was it was more pressure than if it had just been ransomware in the ordinary course of business. And so that definitely seemed like the threat actor was doing a little research in figuring out which type of companies to target.
Yeah, I think that's right, Megan. It really is ranging from the dragnet approach by the threat actors to the very specific rifle shot sniper approach, like Megan described. We've seen instances where threat actors have researched companies who are small in the supply chain, but play a huge and vital role. So they do have that intense leverage to extract the kinds of payments that they're after. And I think to Travis's point, I think the biggest trend, if it is, or new, it's not necessarily new, but it is becoming so commonplace that the plausible deniability is never an option and no longer an action. We're seeing pressure from all sides, from regulatory bodies. We're specifically watching the New York Department of Financial Services, who is currently undergoing a rulemaking. Obviously, we'll be talking about the SEC requirements, those from CISA. Everywhere there are attorneys general. So there are regulatory pressures to disclose. And then there's later penalties if a company does not have basic systems in place to detect and to deal with that. We just saw that with Drizzly just this week, where the FTC entered into a consent order for a infraction that the FTC deemed was inadequate for protecting customer data. So all these pressures are leading to a point where it's not a matter of if, but when, and there are severe penalties, not just from fines and government actions, but severe reputational damage if you're not prepared.
Yeah, and I think preparedness is one of those trends too. You know, it's what's old is new again. The threat actors are using a lot of the same TTPs as always because they're self-interested. They don't want to innovate if they don't have to. They're going to use the same blunt instruments again and again, where our clients and the business field is spending more time getting prepared, running through their tabletops, understanding their communication plan. They're able to mitigate risk more. So I think we are seeing a lot more folks investing in that space, building out their team appropriately, and therefore able to mitigate, the chances that they are going to get hit by ransomware, which is very encouraging because I think ultimately we may see new things, right? We may see data integrity tampering, where you have a threat actor coming in and saying, I didn't take things, but I messed with some stuff, and do you want to know what that is? Then you better pay me for it. Those things keep us all awake at night. But for right now, I think we are just tackling and blocking those necessary fundamentals to prevent it. And so it's an encouraging moment for the field and the response. But ultimately, a lot of the same TTPs are out there and they're being used again and again and again for whoever can be exploited.
Dan, to that point, what advantages does the attacker have, or does the company have in knowing their adversary? in terms of sort of responding to a ransomware attack?
It's always helpful to have a strong hunch, either by identifying, whatever point of leverage they've used, or even identifying the language in a ransom note can give you a strong hunch that you're then working to confirm, as opposed to starting from nil, and having no idea. I think a lot of executives and even their IT teams may not have the time, the bandwidth to be constantly surveying, what those look like, but that's why we're here. That's why you have forensic response teams and privacy counsel involved, is to help identify, okay, if this is Lockbit, then we can expect there's going to be data leakage communication needs. And let's pull that from our incident response playbook so that we're prepared. And as the investigation is confirming some of our hunches, we're moving faster because we're anticipating. I think one of the great things about incident response and this panel is we're talking so much about anticipation. So where you're able to identify who may be behind an incident, it means you can pull things from your guidelines, your playbook, your plan, and be ready to leverage them faster, because speed is of the most importance when it comes to responding to a threat actor.
Completely agree with you, Dan. Last year we discussed the SEC's proposed new cybersecurity rules, which would, among other things, require reporting of material ransomware attacks within 4 days of a materiality determination. While the SEC's cybersecurity rules have not yet been finalized, they have gone through public comment. I've certainly looked at all of the comments. It doesn't look like any of them are going to fundamentally change the direction of the rules. And at some point, probably this year, they will be finalized. Megan, can you talk to us a little bit about how companies might want to start preparing now for those rules before they get finalized?
Yes, absolutely. We're actually fielding a lot of questions from companies that are asking that, like, exactly, how do we start preparing? Should we start incorporating language into our 10Ks and proxies now? Typically, we're not seeing actual disclosure language getting incorporated into those filings at this point, but doing the fundamental groundwork in order to be able to make those disclosures once the rule is finalized is certainly something that we're helping our clients out with. So one of the things we're taking a look at are incident response plans, making sure that there is that sort of materiality analysis during an incident, and that assessment is constantly being done as the facts are coming in and as the incident is developing. So making sure that there's that reminder in the incident response plan that companies have thought through what is going to be a material incident for us, because that's very much going to vary depending on what the company does or what sort of industry that the company is. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the 4 days to report, making sure that that's noted in the incident response plan. And then there's the new requirement to think about immaterial incidents and whether in the aggregate they could constitute a material cybersecurity incident. And so thinking about, okay, how are we going to, what metrics are we going to use? What are we going to think as far as what might be similar incidents that in the aggregate could add up to a material incident? So all of that, again, like as Dan was saying, that preparedness, thinking through before we're actually in a live incident is something that we're trying to help our clients with to get ahead of this rule.
That's very helpful advice. And look, while the SEC is one agency that is doing a rulemaking around cybersecurity, it's not the only one. And frankly, many of you may have seen that yesterday, President Biden penned an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about data protection and cybersecurity, and made clear that it will be the administration's priority to work with Congress on these issues, and also to encourage the administration to continue to be active in this space. And so another agency that we've seen quite active is CISA at DHS. Owners of critical infrastructure are already required to report, or will be required to report, breaches to CISA within 72 hours or within 24 hours if the company makes a ransom payment under the new federal law, the Strengthening America Cybersecurity Act. When we think about this law, Trent, against the backdrop of continued ransomware attacks against critical infrastructure companies, what do you think will be the practical impact on companies that own and operate critical infrastructure?
Well, they're going to have an advanced preparedness and response plan to deal with this. You mentioned the quick shot clock that's being anticipated by CISA. Those rulemakings have not been finalized yet. We talked about the SEC. They were talking about reporting within 4 days. And a lot of what we deal with from a communications perspective during these very tense situations is not to over communicate too early, because we're in the fog of war. We're under the intense pressure of an attack, and we often don't know what's going on. I think Dan and Megan can talk to some of the forensics, but it often takes a lot of time to understand what material may have been exfiltrated, what is at risk. And we counsel our clients a lot of times to be very, very careful not to over communicate. Target is a perfect example of what not to do, because you do not want to get too far forward and later have to retract something that turns out to be inaccurate. So I think the lesson is not only from a CISA perspective, but for any company, whether it's publicly traded, like Megan was saying, you might have to file an AK, or even if you're privately traded, these are reputational issues. You can lose customers, your systems can go down. And so the kind of preparation, real pressure testing, scenario planning, like what happens if my email goes down? What if we are in a Stone Age situation where I cannot communicate to my customers, my clients, my biggest clients? These are all the things that we put together through tabletop exercises to make sure the companies are trying to really look at everything that could happen and has happened to a lot of other companies.
Yeah. And Trent, you make a very good point about the fog of war and the challenges we often face early in an incident when you don't know necessarily everything that happened. And now you have to start making disclosures, either publicly or in very short turnaround to the government. I can't help but wonder whether you or Megan might have any suggestions that you might have for companies and how you navigate the ultimate duty to disclose early before you know information, especially on the SEC side in particular, making sure that you're not somehow accused of withholding information, material information that would have been that a reasonable shareholder, would have wanted to know.
Well, they're judgment calls, and I think the most important thing is to have a team that has dealt with this from a legal communications. Your insurers obviously play a very important role in this, and to think through these things, because there's so much gray out there. The rules haven't been written, and you're seeing in the case of FTC that there is a retroactive function if the FTC deems that your response or your safeguards were inappropriate. So it's really having that expert team in place at the preparation stage. So as I said, you're pressure testing all these things. And then when you're going through that fog of war, like Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. And that really is the case when you're dealing with a cyber incident. When a threat actor calls and says, I need $5 million, I'm going to post your data on the dark web or through some other communications channel, and the threat actors are getting very, very adept at doing just that, that presents, an additional factor. And then one final thing, I'll defer to Dan and Megan, is oftentimes disclosure isn't prompted by a regulatory requirement. It's often prompted by dealing with vendors or a call center or having to inform clients. So there are any number of ways that news can get out. And now that there's a cottage industry of media and others, competitors, sell-side analysts that are looking for this data, it's just a minefield.
Yeah. Arguably, one of the biggest changes over the last few years has been a shift towards more preventative action by companies who anticipate being targets of ransomware and cyber attacks. Dan, can you walk us through the tools that would be in your ransomware toolbox?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where there's encouraging news. Trent makes great points around communication. And as Megan was saying too, communication is one of those things that's always going to have to be very flexible depending on the audience and the circumstances. But we have seen significant gains in a lot of, especially the automated tools that we can now leverage. We are, of course, always conscious of the fact that there's no such thing as 100% effective cybersecurity, and tools are as important as the people who are wielding them. So we always want to make sure that you're right-sized, what you're using, and who's able to use it effectively within your organization or for your organization. But there are a lot of great tools out there to prevent ransomware. And we're, again, moving from that manual space of file share mapping and considering permissions to the more automated EDR tools that are fantastic and available on the market and should be evaluated for an individual business's needs, and also should be evaluated for who is able to be monitoring those tools and make sure that they're checking for abnormalities in the network, reviewing any sort of malware detections or other alerts, and optimally, if it's my toolbox, pairing it with managed detection and response and or security operations center. So there's a brain trust that is advanced in this space and understands how to use the tool and then how to reflect back when you have either a false positive or a genuine positive to respond to. But this is counterintuitive maybe to everything I just listed, but you also want to keep it simple and make sure that you are, again, right-sizing to your needs. You don't want too many softwares, too many things integrated that create new problems for yourself and your staff or your managed service provider. But it allows you to functionally feel that you are maybe not at 100% because it's not possible, but getting as close as you possibly can. And at the same time, considering surrounding systems. If you have very old systems, then your staff is spending more time on the management of those systems. That is time they could otherwise be spending on security. So don't just look at what exact tools are on cybersecurity, but look at the rest of your environment and where upgrades can make you more efficient and free up more of your personnel and other resources to be considerate of those resources. So if that's my toolbox, those are the things that I'm looking for and the considerations that I have in mind, Travis.
One thing I totally agree with everything that Dan just said, and one of the things that really resonated with me was don't overcomplicate things. Also understand the tools that you have. How many times has the company been well, we have a seam, but did you actually have all of the right logs feeding into it so that now we can do the analysis, making sure that it's not just management saying oh, we need all of these things, so we're going to get them. Make sure that the teams that need to run them and are going to need them in that moment of crisis actually know how to use them and have been using them is also something that I still get surprised at how often those sort of issues come up.
Yeah, it was running, so I thought we were protected. Well, who was watching it? Oh, it needed someone to be watching it? Okay, we've got some work to do. You gotta jump right in and make sure that you're right, that there is that pairing.
Well, you talk about all these advanced technologies, which are critical, but I was just surprised the IBM's cost of a cyber attack report out of 22 identified that close to 80% of companies in the critical infrastructure space do not use zero trust, which is a basic block and tackle tactic that is very effective. And it goes back to how we began the conversation, which is, the bar is rising in terms of having these defenses in place. And so you can no longer get away with, well, I didn't have zero trust in place. I mean, that is really a necessity for, especially in the critical infrastructure space. So that goes to show that the scrutiny for missteps and gaping holes in your hygiene and your approach to cybersecurity are no longer an excuse.
Yeah, so we now have our toolbox from Dan. We have our zero trust principles from Trent. Megan, we have our principles. Is this now when we start to draft up that incident response plan? And are you advising clients to have bespoke incident response plans for ransomware events? And what would be different between a traditional incident response plan and one that maybe is a bit more tailored to ransomware?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I consistently counsel clients that the more that we can do on the front end, the better. And so we definitely don't want to be thinking through these decisions for the first time live during an incident. And so, yes, we want to make sure there's an incident response plan. We want to make sure we review it frequently, at least annually, and that we also practice them and have tabletop exercises. And ideally, totally agree with you, Travis, that there should also be a bespoke plan for ransomware incidents because they're just so different from some of the other type of malware incidents that we're dealing with. For like whether like the operational impact that it can have if your systems are actually down and how you're going to need to deal with that and communicating with customers and making sure that you can get your systems back up. Just the idea of like whether you're going to pay the ransom and communicate about that. There's a lot of specific issues for ransomware. It also moves very quickly. And so you don't have the luxury of time in those kind of scenarios. So I think having that bespoke ransomware playbook, I think you said it was only 30% of companies that have that. That's very concerning that 70% of companies are going to have to be doing it on the fly as they're working through a ransomware incident.
Yeah, that number shocked me as well, Megan. But of course, no one listening to this panel would ever be in that 70%. Dan, continuing on the incident response plans, one component of incident response is or should be vendor management. How do you build in vendor management to the preventative preparation process? And when in the incident response planning should companies assess their contracts or the security of their vendors?
Yeah, it's good data governance. So if you are working with vendors, you want to understand what data they will have access to or otherwise be processing on your behalf. And with that comes understanding what their security profile looks like. You're offering those questions, not just once at the inception of the relationship, but continually. So you understand how their security profile may be evolving. And that will then allow you, of course, to shift risk, shift liability in the contracting process and in the renewal of contracting process to make it less of a pass-fail necessarily, especially if they play a fundamental role to your operations, but to at least be cognizant of where their liability ends and yours begins, and be constantly evaluating that, especially as we've heard about the regulations and the laws that are going into effect that can change what those requirements look like, not just of you, but then what you're pouring down to your vendors. And when it comes to considering that in your incident response, well, let's just use the healthcare industry, for instance. If you are a business associate to any number of covered entities under HIPAA, knowing what your obligations may be in part of incident response means understanding what's committed to in those business associate agreements and how you are going to respond accordingly while you're also addressing all the other considerations that we've talked to. And a point that Megan just hit on, when it comes to incident response planning, and especially tabletop exercises, taking a modular approach, and I think you'll probably hear this throughout today's panels, but a modular approach that considers different types of incidents, including one that is either where the data that you're processing or managing on for your clients is impacted, and or where one of your vendors has been impacted. And really focusing on an exercise along those lines can point out where there may be fundamental gaps in understanding of what the response looks like, or even how you're going to access the necessary information if you haven't already tracked it to understand what your communication and reporting obligations may be, or otherwise where you might want to be considering that communication plan more holistically because of the famous, well, we want to be really transparent approach that I think we hear from a lot of our clients, in those first moments after an issue has been discovered. So it is a matter of being proactive, understanding what's required of you, but then also continually gauging from your vendors what they owe you, and as far as notification if they have an incident, or what you may owe others because you are in the vendor seat to others and want to be proactive in understanding what kind of information you have to share with them.
In the context of tailoring your incident response plan to custom scenarios, and in particular ransomware, we got a question from the audience that asks, what are the specific differences that are needed in a ransomware incident response plan? In other words, what are the kinds of issues or topics that you would address in a ransomware incident response plan that you might not normally cover in your normal traditional incident response plan?
I'll jump in first on this. I think you have to talk about payment, and even negotiation. And I'm sure we'll touch on this because it's part of the preparedness. But what if the ransom demand is $50,000? What if the ransom demand is $5 million? Who is making decisions around that? What information is needed to even make that decision? What your process looks like as far as OFAC checks and due diligence around the threat actors, demand and encryption software are all, I think, specific to ransomware. But Megan, Trent, really interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I really think that ransom payment is a huge aspect of it, because I think some companies, they also might just gloss over it and just say like, oh yeah, we'd never pay a ransom. But they don't think through like, okay, well, what if this type of information was impacted? What if our systems are down for this period of time and we couldn't run our business? And there's just so many facets of ransom. So even like the ransom payment aspect, that can be broken down, and we think through the different scenarios of how you can be ransomed and whether and pressure test those sort of points, and really thinking through like who is going to make that call at the end of the day, because we don't want to all these different people and we're all talking about it live or during the incident, and no one feels empowered knowing that okay, I have the authority or I'm the ultimate person, or this group of people are the people that need to make that decision, especially if the ransomware is happening on a holiday or a weekend at an inopportune time, to make sure that those right people are looped in and involved in that situation. So all of that, in developing the ransomware playbook, you're having those conversations in order to embed that into the playbook. And that's what's very valuable as well.
Yeah, it's the pay not pay question is fundamental to the planning. And you can't, to Megan's point, anticipate what the demand will be or what kind of information they have or what kind of damage is potentially out there. But you have to look at the not pay scenario, because if the threat actor isn't likely to put out what kind of information they have and they only ask for X million dollars, you have to have a communications plan in place to inform your clients, customers, stakeholders, investors why you didn't spend what on the outside might be seeming like a pittance of money to protect that data. And that's why working with law enforcement is so critical, because they do have experience and can tell you that, there is honor amongst thieves in some of these threat actors. They understand that if they do not honor the deal, and it seems really creepy, but if they do not honor the deal, they are less likely to get paid in the future. So they know that. We've been working with a latest group called Black Basta, and the client has been working very well with law enforcement, and learned that they actually do respect the fact that if you have ransom payment, they do keep the information under lock and key. But those are the kinds of considerations that you have to go into, because again, it's not a parlor game. You have to really look at these kinds of scenarios from not being able to do business. To Megan's point, these are real life scenarios that have happened.
Let's stick with the to pay or not pay issue for just a little while longer. Megan, are there costs to paying a ransom beyond the asking price? If a company's hit with a ransomware attack and chooses to engage, how should they craft their response, both in terms of assessing the damage and determining whether to pay?
Yeah, I do think that there's definitely a cost beyond just the actual ransom payment that a company would be making. It's potentially a reputational cost. There may be some customers or some in the public or media that think this is negotiating with terrorists or and so that perception might be something that companies don't want. There's also some people that might say that, oh, well, by making these payments, you're helping to perpetuate these types of attacks. And so continuing that sort of ecosystem of ransomware. And so companies might not want to be associated with that kind of thought process as well. So the reputational perception that companies might not want to have. It could also be seen as putting a target on the company's back, because threat actors know, well, that company paid in the past, they might pay again, so let's try and go after them and really look into where there might be gaps in their systems. So that's a risk that companies take when they agree to pay a ransom. And as far as crafting a response, I think it's really helpful to maintain optionality. So like earlier we had talked about like people that in a vacuum, they say like, oh, we'd never pay a ransom. And so they want to just come out charging and like, no, not going to engage with threat actors, very much just want to cut off that communication. But as Trent was saying, at the beginning, when we're in the thick of it, we don't have a lot of information. So the company might say like, oh, well, we have backups, so we're going to just restore from backups. But were those backups encrypted? Were they actually backed up? We might not know that right from the get-go. And so until we're able to get that sort of information, we might not know whether the threat actors took data initially, or what data they took and how valuable that is. And so being able to have the time to do that sort of investigation and figure out what we're really dealing with and get our arms around the incident is very valuable. So not like getting ahead of ourselves and just saying no, or like saying something that might aggravate the threat actor and make them act rashly, is all of the sort of things that we do not want to do.
Yeah, I mean, we've had instances, I think we all have, where a threat actor communicates directly with clients or directly with employees, saying we have your PII, or we have, your contract data, or we have your bank account information. And that's a real clear and present danger that anybody needs to think through. And sometimes it's not even that sophisticated. It's going back to the Stone Age scenario. What happens if my email goes down? How do you communicate with your clients? Do you have phone trees? Do you have a separate email system set up in the cloud or elsewhere, so you can act during the fog of war, where the pressures for information and reporting and decision making is the most intense? So all these things are what's critical to going into that tabletop exercise. And again, I'm going to put in a plug in for communications. Don't leave communications at the kids' table at Thanksgiving, because a lot of times we see the clients have rock solid incident response plans, but they don't include communications, whether that be to regulators, employees. We've had situations where all it takes is one employee to flip an email that was sent out from human resources about using new laptops, and then all of a sudden that's all over the press. So that's why consistency in messaging across all the platforms, across all your audiences, is so critical.
We often in this conversation focus on, the risks of payment. One of the risks to not paying is, particularly if the decision is made by the board of a public company, for example, is fiduciary duties, right? I mean, if your network is down, it's encrypted, and you're a director of a public company, your duties to the company, and that may necessitate payment. If that is the most expedient way to get up and operational and get moving again, you may actually have a duty to have the company make the payment. Payments are an issue that continue to perennially come up again and again every year. But how do you plan for them? I mean, that's important too, right? Sometimes we find clients, they're in the middle of an incident. Now they start to think about, payment. But what if you have the ability now, like everyone here, to begin to prep for it? Dan, if a negotiator or other support is needed, how do you plan for that proactively?
Yeah, I think I hope you have cyber liability insurance, and that you're vetting what that coverage looks like with your carrier and your broker, so that you can understand who may be approved to assist in a response, including whether as a negotiator, and sort of where that may be built into the incident response process, because that familiarity with those parties will help again with anticipation. And then understanding also, where's payment coming from? Is it a direct wire from the entity? Is it coming from carrier insurance? Is that money available, or would otherwise need to be set aside? There are just those fundamental things that I think Megan said earlier. It's easier to say, like, we never pay, and then you get into it and the backups aren't there and you're suddenly in a little bit of a scramble. So walk through the what if scenarios and walk through the what kind of negotiator would we want. Walk through the jurisdictional and regulatory implications of where you sit and where which regulations apply, so that you're conscious of those when it comes to potential payment and who may be appropriate for negotiation and facilitating and brokering a payment as well. Walk through what an OFAC check looks like currently, and understanding that while we see these new groups popping up and splintering off of other groups, we still may have to consider in the midst of negotiation, once we get that decryptor tool, is it a derivative of another tool from a sanctioned entity? And what does that mean? So it is, you start going down all the different what if scenarios, and there's a wealth of questions that you want to work internally to answer when you're running through an exercise or as the result of an exercise, rather than doing it. But I think familiarity and asking questions early and often is really that baseline, simple guiding principle when it comes to figuring out what negotiation would look like. And even if you say we're not going to pay and you're going to be in a faux negotiation, there's a lot of information that can be understood from that faux negotiation, as Trent highlighted, including what they took. Oftentimes we're seeing threat actors think that they're taking really important information, but it's all about the entity. It's not maybe the client data that exfiltrated means very different implications. And being able to source and poke around in what they're saying they took, or even where they came up with a demand. Oh, you think we have $5 million? Why do you think that? And then they point out a detail that someone, your CFO or someone in finance, knows is only in one spreadsheet in one place. And it helps you craft a narrative around how to negotiate, but it also can provide insight into what was potentially or threatened to have been exfiltrated. So Travis, I got a little off track there with the answer, but there's just the takeaway is there's a million questions to ask in advance of negotiation, and sort of what your purpose is and who you want involved in it.
No worries at all. In fact, it tees up a question that we received from the audience. What level of effectiveness are you seeing paying ransom and recovering an encryption key from the bad actor? Any thoughts on that these days?
I think it varies depending on the threat actor group. And so that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Having a lot of intel about the threat actor group is helpful to know whether they are one of the more reputable criminal groups and actually stick to their word or not. But if they are, then yeah, that is something that we're seeing, that they do tend to follow through when they get payment on the decryption key. I mean, we've had situations where the threat actor intended to give you a decryption key that actually didn't work the way it was supposed to. And then they actually gave us a discount on that ransom payment. So the threat actor recognized that, oh yeah, it's actually not working as well as it's supposed to be. But otherwise, as long as it's a threat actor that we have intel on that has paid in the past, or that has delivered in the past, then they tend to follow through.
I love it. It comes with a warranty, an encryption key with a warranty. That is great. Trent, one of the things we talked about much earlier in the conversation was how the threat actors themselves are getting into the communications game. We see ransomware actors running their own press releases on the dark web, or communicating directly with the press, or directly with employees or clients to encourage payment of a ransom. How should companies prepare for that scenario when the threat actor is engaging in a public PR campaign against the company?
Well, it comes to the right cadence of communications. So the bar is high about disclosing that there was an incident. And so you certainly do not want to cede the field to the threat actor to start defining the narrative. And that's true for any public relations issue, whether it's cybersecurity or an accident or anything else, because the old iron law is he who frames first usually wins. And that is true. So you're absolutely right. The threat actors know this. They're becoming much more adept at hanging that Damocles sword of threatening to put all this information on the internet, or doing snippets to demonstrate to the company and to potentially their competitors or to regulators that they have this information. And then it's the threat actors that have the microphone and the megaphone and have you on the defensive. So that the short answer to your question is that's why it's important to disclose at the very earliest when you can a small amount of information that we have had an incident, we are investigating it, we have retained the great forensics firms that are all available, and we're doing an investigation. And if it's necessary, we're working with law enforcement. So you are the ones that are informing your clients, your customers, regulators, and others that there has been an incident, that you're looking into it and you're prepared. And that our system, in going back to what a lot of this discussion about preparation, it's ideal to say that our systems discovered that there was an incident, because that demonstrates that you did have the kinds of defenses that Dan and Megan have been describing through our panel discussion. So that initial disclosure is critical, and then it really becomes a very case-by-case basis, which is why you need expert teams, is because after that, you need to let the investigation run its course, because you do not want to give the implication that our systems are back up. This is not like your power getting knocked out during a storm, or this is not about a regular IT outage. These things take a lot of time, and what we see clients want to rush and say, oh, well, this was limited to a very small portion of our data or whatever, and then they have to retract, and it turns into a big mess. So those are the two initial considerations that companies want to take in the very early days of an attack.
Yeah. Megan, what do you think about the proactive messaging that Trent just suggested? How proactive should a company really be when disclosing information? And importantly, how do you think about these disclosures in the context of potential litigation?
I think this can vary depending on the company and the particular industry that the company's in. For some company, and also the scenario and the incident that they're dealing with, and as Trent was saying, like whether they discovered it, whether we have good facts to tell, whether we don't have a good story, whether we had not the greatest security that allowed for the incident to happen. So there's going to be a lot of factors that go into that assessment. But I think it makes sense for some companies to be more transparent and provide updates more frequently or more detailed updates than for some other companies. So for example, if you're in manufacturing or shipping and there's an operational impact, your customers need to know, like, well, when are you going to be back online? When am I going to be able to get my products from you again? Being able to provide those sort of updates can be very helpful and make it really seem like you're in control of the situation and in constant communication with customers. Also, if you're a cybersecurity company and so your brand is cybersecurity, like they still experience security incidents as well, but being able to provide more detail, like technical information about this is what the threat actor was doing, and we're like giving you more intel about the threat actor to help build our cybersecurity community. That can help with continuing to have trust in the brand. But going back to, if there's not good facts to tell, if we didn't have good security, then maybe we don't include as much detail and don't provide as many updates as frequently. And so I think it varies depending on the circumstances of the particular incident, which is why you work with folks like Trent and his team to make sure that they can help you provide those sort of teeing it up in a way that's going to make the most sense for the particular incident that the company's going through.
And then you work with Megan and me to ensure that litigation risk is minimized from the messaging that Trent and co are going to develop. Well, look, today's conversation, unfortunately, has come to an end. I hope that everyone enjoyed it as much as me. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Trent. Thank you, Megan, for insightful thoughts into how to prepare for, how to respond to ransomware attacks in 2023. Bruce, back to you.
Thank you to all the panelists. And Travis, thanks for the skillful moderating. Really appreciate it.